We are on the other side of the first ever PWHL expansion draft. Seattle and Vancouver have some new faces. We're also going to break down what we kind of thought about the process and get you ready for the next step in building out the rosters for Vancouver and Seattle. All that on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report, part of the Locked On NHL channel and a part of the greater Locked On Podcast Network. Erica L. Ayala here alongside Rachel Donner. Rachel is your co-host of the Locked On Flyers podcast, also co-hosts the Friday episodes of Locked On NHL. I am your host of the Locked On Kraken podcast. We're happy to be here with you. Today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. We know we've got the Stanley Cup Finals going on, the NBA Finals happening, so definitely an opportunity for you to get in on the action. Woo! Speaking of action, Rachel, of course, and we noted this in the last episode because we knew it was going to happen, but it's like immediately stop recording. And then, of course, PWHL Seattle round out their first round of signings with none other than Corrine Schroeder.
Listen, I was very wrong. And actually, that's not true. I was half wrong because I said that they shouldn't sign her, not that they wouldn't sign her. So I think there's a very different opinion there. But that being said, yes. So Seattle did get a goaltender in Corrine Schroeder, who, as we said, and is honestly true, she had a mixed bag of a season. Like when she was very good, she was very, very good. But she had some real clunkers in a way that was a little outsized of a typical goalie experience. And so it's certainly a risky signing, but a solid signing for Seattle to start their goaltender collection.
Yeah, for sure. I was a little more on the positive side of Corrine Schroeder. I'm leaning into when you get a solid version of Corrine Schroeder, you really know what you're getting there. And I think that having someone with experience in the league and able to give you elite level performances in net when you're an expansion team, not necessarily knowing what you're going to get, because we'll talk about it. We don't exactly know what the draft order is coming up. I think that you want to be able to at least get a cornerstone. And I think that's what Seattle gets in Corrine Schroeder. But of course, the big question is what they will do to support Corrine. Because if we have a little bit more of a, quote unquote, equitable split in net, I think that's a real opportunity for Seattle. And as we've already talked about on the podcast, that seemed to have helped Minnesota, arguably. So, maybe if you have a target in mind, you want to make a play for another goaltender. If you get Corrine Schroeder, you can get someone who can start, has started in the PWHL, but even more so can give you still pretty elite level starts and performances if and when you get another goaltender. Well, yeah, I'm going to get another goaltender.
Yes.
Like a pro ready, I guess is what I'm trying to say, goaltender.
Yeah, it is interesting because neither Seattle nor Vancouver selected a goaltender in the expansion draft. So each team is still, with one goalie slot open or one main goalie slot open. Obviously, each team has three in their rotation, but I think that it was just a really interesting choice, and that the teams are going to try and fill those goaltending slots through free agency and the draft.
Yes, and we will talk about both of those things on today's episode. But first, we have to talk about what we actually saw happen in the expansion draft, including that on our last episode, Rachel, we really couldn't tell folks what is the order, what is the kind of run of show, how are things going to look, because we just didn't have those details. Again, probably going to be a theme for today's show. Sorry, but that's the hand that we've been dealt. But we do know that in what was called a lottery, right? At the top of the programming, so to speak, for the PWHL expansion draft, Jana Hefford, kind of it dropped some eggs, tennis or ping pong balls. Who knows what they were? Some vessel was dropped into another vessel. And that's how it was determined that Vancouver got to choose whether they got the first pick in the expansion draft or a la the snake draft, if they would get picks 2 and 3. And Rachel, they decided to take the first overall pick, and they took Ashton Bell.
They did. And honestly, I thought it was a very good pick. I think that's who I would have selected if I were Vancouver. Now, if I was Seattle and had that first pick, I would have gone with Hannah Bilka, which they wound up getting in the third pick there. But I think, based on what those different teams were doing, I do think those first 3 picks did make sense overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of talked about this a little bit, but on the last episode, the breakdown of, more Canadian versus more US, depending on the market, Seattle versus Vancouver. We also talked about, though, that I specifically mentioned that I was very curious to see who would be the first player born outside of North America to be taken in the expansion draft or signed to an expansion draft team. Because again, Corrine Schroeder signed before the actual expansion draft. And we got that answer in pick number 2, Aneta Terelova from the Ottawa Charge. So in the first 2 picks, Rachel, the Ottawa Charge lose 2 defenders, which, we will talk about a little bit more later in the show. But let's go through Vancouver. They had the first pick, Ashton Bell. Aneta Terelova and Hannah Bilka go 2 and 3. Then to Vancouver, Brooke McQuaid goes from the Minnesota Frost at 4. Abby Boreen also to Vancouver at 5, because again, snake draft. So then picks 6 and 7. Pick number 6, friend of the podcast, Jesse Eldridge from the New York Sirens, goes to Seattle. Julia Gosling from the Toronto Scepters, formerly, I should say now, goes to Seattle. And then picks 8 and 9, Izzy Daniel from Toronto, Gabby Rosenthal from New York to Vancouver. Then we go Anna Wilgren and Megan Carter, Montreal and Toronto, respectively, to Seattle. Then we have, this was a big one. And also I noticed the chat. There's something specific I want to talk about here. Denisa Krishova, yes, Krishova, goes to Vancouver along with Sydney Bard. The last pick in the expansion draft, Emily Brown. So I really have talked about how I love Kara Mori. And I loved even more that, in my estimation, and also according to our good friend Preston at the Czech Women's Hockey Report, that she pronounced Denisa's name at least as closely to accurate as we've heard in some time. That did send the chat into a tizzy. And there were some Minnesota fans that were very angry and felt that Vancouver didn't deserve a player, Rachel, whose name they couldn't pronounce correctly.
Listen, I know people are doing the best they can in this situation, but I do think there is something to that. I also think that, to be fair, Minnesota Frost fans were a little bit salty about Vancouver because of the way the distribution worked out, where the 4 Minnesota Frost players that were lost in the expansion draft all went to Vancouver. Seattle got 0 former Minnesota Frost players. So I'm just going to put that out there that was an extra layer to
Right.
the saltiness.
It was a low hanging fruit. They were like, and now you're not saying the name the way we're familiar with. Oh, get out of here, Vancouver. That is, yeah, because we've talked about they took 2 defenders from that two-time championship winning team. I mean, that's a pretty big blow. That's a big blow. I mean, and again, it's a pretty good play for Vancouver to stock up with some assets from a team that has not 1, but 2, the only 2 championships in league history. I mean, is that a missed opportunity then, do we think, for Seattle, or do we kind of like what they picked maybe for, what they're trying to build?
I mean, one could argue that the Seattle team decimated the New York Sirens in return. So I feel like, even though there was 3 and not 4 former Sirens, but when you look at Corrine Schroeder, goaltender, Alex Carpenter, there, as well as Jesse Eldridge, I mean, that is a huge chunk of the Sirens core. So, yeah. I mean, I think Ottawa and New York are the 2 teams that are going to have the toughest road to rebuild their rosters following this expansion draft.
Yeah, which is really interesting because Ottawa, made what seems like, quite honestly, a miraculous push to the playoffs, and now have to go back to the drawing board with New York. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more, but I mean, let me just say, big spoiler alert to those who listen to the show every week. I think that more than just the roster probably needs some amending in New York. And so I think it's curious to see if and how New York can rebuild through the draft or even in free agency, and if that maybe gets them a little bit closer to a style of play that, I don't know, kind of makes sense for the personnel that they have. I don't know. I just have a lot of questions. But again, we can get into that. I think overall, this is pretty solid. I think we do get a little bit of a sense of the identity, especially in my estimation, with how Vancouver made their picks. I see these as, all in, definitely going to work towards the greater goal of the squad type players, and that's always fun as someone who, again, for the Locked On Network covers an expansion team. You do need some of that, right? Versus Seattle, who especially being able to get not just Hillary Knight, but Alex Carpenter. I mean, Kayla Barnes is pretty big too, at least as far as footprint in USA hockey.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going for, are we kind of saying this is the Vegas versus Seattle of expansion drafts?
I mean, you're not wrong. That is for sure. I do think that's one of the things that was most interesting is there were very clearly 2 very distinct approaches to the expansion draft and putting together a well-rounded roster versus, positional star choices here. And I think, especially when you look at the fact that Vancouver in their distribution had 1 more forward than Seattle did. Seattle is also, in addition to getting what is perhaps a future top line in the league with Carpenter, Knight, and Bilka, they also built from the blue line out in a lot of ways. And so I just find the 2 different approaches really interesting.
Yeah, and it's all a matter of what the head coaches who have yet to be named, what they can do here, because it's different in having a vision as a general manager, and then I think all teams in all sports that ever existed on the face of the earth are trying to find the right balance of what the GM is cooking up in the lab, so to speak, versus how to execute that. And do you get a coach that can execute the GM's plan? Do you get a GM that trusts and believes in what the coach is doing? How do the players and the roster ultimately fit into that? And we just don't know. So those are the things that I think are understandable, Rachel, for us not to know. These are not complete rosters. We still have another signing window. We still have effectively what I'm calling an entry draft. However, I do think whether it's talking about the expansion draft or even the upcoming, again, entry draft, what we can expect there, there are also some ambiguities, some maybe just lack of information being shared that make me kind of scratch my head. Are there things that the PWHL did right? Do we like how things went? Are there things where we want more information? I think I kind of already answered that. But we'll talk about that coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report. As I mentioned at the top of the show, today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. We know the NBA finals are really active here. Shout out to OKC. I'm in Oklahoma right now. But we also, of course, know that the Stanley Cup final, I mean, how many overtimes have we seen already? Every night delivering highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, yeah, I'll say, and can't miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And you can do that with FanDuel because they make it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. But it's not just those leagues that are in championship mode. You also, of course, have the WNBA, MLB. I know a lot of people have a lot of things to say about Caitlin Clark as MVP. I think your money's better spent on Nafisa Collier as the ultimate MVP, but you can check out those odds. So many things that you can find at FanDuel. And so if you want to check out, again, playoff odds or the league odds around sports, make sure you head to FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Rachel, we talked a little bit about the expansion draft, but even last episode, we were like, we'd love to tell you the draft order, but we just don't know. We'd love to tell you what to expect when it comes to the overall kind of production, but we just don't know. And as we prepare for, again, the entry draft and even this signing window, that's a little bit more cut and dry. There are still things, Rachel, that we just don't know.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to the Women's Hockey Report. Erica Ayala here. And of course, after we recorded, we did get some news about the entry draft. So here you go. What we know right now is that the entry draft will follow the order that was laid out with the gold plan and, of course, how the 2025 playoffs played out. So the New York Sirens with the number 1 pick, followed by the Boston Fleet, Toronto Scepters, Montreal Victoire, Ottawa Charge, Minnesota Frost. Those picks will be the same for all rounds. Now, there was a lottery where, once again, Vancouver won over Seattle, so Vancouver will get the first pick in the first round among the expansion teams, followed by Seattle. The teams, though, will alternate positions in all subsequent rounds of the draft. And as I mentioned, the 6 inaugural teams will maintain their order of selection in all 6 rounds. Let's get back to our previously recorded episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
Let's start with the expansion draft, though. When you got to see everything, how everything played out, what stood out to you as what you liked and things that you just wish that we knew going into the draft as opposed to learning in the moment?
Yeah, I understand the concept of the snake draft, and I think it works better in the standard entry draft rather than in an expansion draft. I think I would have preferred if they were alternating picks here, and maybe that extends the draft time too long because you need to have the break windows and the on the clock time periods. So maybe the snake is the way to speed it up, and I get that to some degree, but I do think alternating picks might have been the better way to go with 2 teams involved. So that was kind of my first thing that I noticed.
Yeah, it seems like the PWHL is really enamored and enthralled by the snake draft, but I'm with you. I don't know that we need that. I don't know that we need that. And
Yeah.
I just think that especially if you're snaking the draft, and at least as the viewer, right? We don't know. We didn't know until the night of what the picks were. Now, I've seen leagues like Unrivaled where they literally recorded the draft and, and then aired it basically. So to the extent that Vancouver and Seattle didn't know what was going on, I can't speak to that, directly. But it just is like picking, alternating versus snaking and assuming, right? Assuming that they literally didn't know where they were going to pick, in what order they were going to pick. Like that's a lot of work that you have to do basically on the fly. And I guess there's a world in which it can be entertaining to watch, but I guess I'm thinking of it more like from a practical perspective. Is this giving these GMs the opportunity to truly craft the best team possible, where every other league that I'm aware of, the GMs know what their pick is. Then they also know if and how they want to leverage that pick to then get the best team possible.
Yeah. And, I don't think there was enough view into the behind the scenes of it at all. I really think that, while having the expert commentary between picks was good in terms of saying who's the top available, what could they bring to the table, how does that mesh with the past picks that this team has already done. I think, having kind of more insight from the GMs themselves with, logic and reasoning behind those picks, like as it kind of went along, might have been a little bit more compelling here. I think that, while it's very good that they had media availability with these selected players afterwards, I think some immediate reactions over the course of it, I think could have added to the experience of it.
Oh, for sure.
So, it was good. I just think there's ways it could have been better. And I think having the information in a more timely fashion as to how it was going to run and the pick order, plus just having a little bit more dynamic team focus as opposed to commentator focused kind of content coming out might have been a little bit stronger.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before because as more of an inquiry or a question, but is this a result of this league being a single owner? So they can think about the kind of theatrics, right, of the league perspective. But again, I don't know that this necessarily puts GMs and teams in the best spot to build the best possible roster that they can. Or even to your point about the players, having players that I think that if you can make that happen, and we kind of saw that right in the playoffs where whether it was on the official PWHL podcast or in interviews, we were hearing from players, we were hearing from the coaches. I mean, I do think that sports media absolutely jumps the shark when it comes to when we're doing interviews. Like, yeah, your team is on a power play and you're talking to the bench boss in the middle. Like, maybe we don't do that. Maybe we don't do that. Or in the WNBA, there's just some hilarious interviews, coaches being mic'd up and they're like, I absolutely can't hear you. And also I'm trying to get my players in. So there's like, I get it. You don't want to, I personally think there is overkill, but the balance of still interjecting those voices, again, if it's something where you had it a little bit pre-planned, even if those athletes don't come on quote unquote live, is there a way to have them record what it means to join, PWHL Vancouver, PWHL Seattle? Does that take away from the excitement? I don't know. Maybe for some people it does, but it also adds a little bit more storytelling.
Right. And I think with to your point about the single ownership aspect of it, the league is absolutely, and should be, to be clear, invested in the success of these two new teams. And I think in some cases, having an expansion team come into a league and having them be terrible is a rite of passage, right? That makes sense. And in this league, I don't know that it makes.
The Seattle Kraken host.
I get it. But I think that there is good reason to try and tip the scales in this league in particular, but it doesn't make it feel any better for the existing team's fans. And I don't think that, at least at this point, and I know there's no way to see how this whole process actually went until the end of next season,
right?
To be honest.
Right.
But the way it feels now for existing team fans is not great, I gotta say. And I think there needs to be some sort of balancing factor here to make existing team fans feel a little bit better about how this process is going and why it's so brutal for them.
Yeah, I mean, expansion drafts are always hard.
So
but
losing one player is a lot easier than losing 4.
That is true. Fair. Minnesota's like, yeah, we have thoughts. Speaking of, let us know in the chat, what did you like about the expansion draft? What would you change? We want to hear from you, and we'll definitely talk about that. But again, there are a few other dates that we have to keep in mind, so we'll talk about that, as well as who are some top free agent prospects that we might see once again. Looking at you, Minnesota, relocate, not just to Vancouver or Seattle, though, because we're talking free agents, which means, right, they could sign anywhere. So we'll talk about that coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find an amazing candidate fast? Easy, just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. So stop struggling to get your job posting on other sites. Indeed's sponsored job post puts you at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. When you have that new project comes up that requires just the right hire to pull it off, the pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a setback. That's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs can come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates immediately. And you can speed up that hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Women's Hockey Report. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring Indeed is all you need.
All right, Rachel. So expansion draft in the books, the early signing window in the books, but there is another signing window that opens this Monday ahead of the entry draft in Ottawa on June 24th. That signing window is for players on expiring contracts. June 16th, again, that's Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. 9 a.m. Eastern time. We've talked about this a little bit, but especially knowing that each team has one goaltender. We talked about building from the back versus, or I think both teams really did do a good job defensively. Perhaps, as you mentioned, Seattle really trying to get a top line, which I think is a really solid strategy if you think that can really work. But now we're going to use talking about the top free agents to also kind of interweave what we think each team kind of needs, because this is an opportunity for all of the teams, not just Vancouver and Seattle, to get in on the action. So now that we know how teams have been depleted due to the expansion draft, we can kind of talk about teams. So it seems like just by sheer number, right? New York and especially Minnesota, they lost the most players from last year's roster. So what stands out to you as far as maybe some needs for those two teams, and why for the Sirens is it everything?
Listen, it truly is everything. And I think that, while each team did lose the same number of players, the distribution is different. from team to team. So first off, the Sirens are in desperate need of goaltending right now because beyond Schroeder, I think they did struggle in net. And so I think they're kind of back to the drawing board on that front. And then of the other three players, all three are forwards. Like they need scoring. They just don't have forwards that are really
dynamic,
productive, dynamic or productive left on the team. So I think scoring and goaltending is got to be your top two priorities here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, that's talking from a New York perspective. So the goaltenders that are available as free agents from Montreal, Elaine Chuli. I mean, these are names that stood out to me, not the extensive list. But Elaine Chuli is a free agent. Maddie Rooney, a free agent. I know Minnesota fans are like, would you stop? And then you also have Klada Peslarova, who you in particular, Rachel, on previous episodes have talked about, especially on the other side of World Championships. We did see Aaron Frankel with a little bit of an injury. And so Peslarova got some play for the Boston Fleet. I mean, among just those goaltenders, do you think there's someone that New York might want to consider or that they could make an offer to and have them leave their current team or former team or team from last season, I guess?
Right. So here's the interesting thing is that if you're a free agent goaltender in the PWHL right now, you're desperate for a starting job, or at least to be able to compete for a starting job here.
Yep.
And New York is the strongest opportunity to earn a starting job. So I do think that's going to be really appealing for the free agent goaltenders right now.
Yeah. I find it hard to believe that Minnesota won't make a competitive offer to keep Rooney. So I don't know that New York, is going to be able to snatch up Rooney. Then that becomes Peslarova in Boston, just hop on I-95 and there you go. So is that an opportunity, Peslarova to be a player that coming off of, again, a fantastic world championship, someone who has that international experience, could New York be a play there? Again, I think that comes back to what I've alluded to a few times. What is the vision? What are the capabilities of the front office and the coaching staff? And do they see Peslarova as a play here? Or are they going to look for their next goaltender through the entry draft? Which, in fairness, it's not just players coming out of college. In particular, thinking of goaltending, there are some goaltenders with international experience that are looking to come back. I'm thinking of Miri Räisänen as someone. So if New York wanted to get someone with a little bit more tried and true pro level experience, could Miri Räisänen be someone? I still think it's always most advantageous in some respects to get someone that knows the pace, the physicality, the speed of the current league. So that could be interesting. All right. Ottawa, I think, also has some interesting things to figure out, especially when it comes to defense, and their defensive structure wasn't always their strong suit. And so losing two very effective defenders is something that they might want to shore up. And so if you look at some of the free agents when it comes to defenders, Callie Flanagan pops right off the page for me, for sure. This is someone with international experience for USA Hockey. Again, not an extensive list here, but I think for me, looking at the free agents and someone who maybe could be lured with a really competitive contract elsewhere, is Ottawa, would they think of making a play for a defender who has good size comparative to who they've had in the last two seasons?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting option here. It is also, I think, important to say, like, do some of these players want to go closer to home or not?
Right.
I think that could play a factor here. But would Flanagan want to stay in Canada?
Yeah.
Possibly. And I think, the opportunity in Ottawa is really strong, to your point, of getting the minutes and such. So there could be something appealing about that.
Yeah. I mean, and if Flanagan, doesn't want to stay in Canada, wants to be a little closer to home, I mean, is from Massachusetts. So Boston did lose some players, but especially from their forwards. So is Minnesota enough of a draw? I don't know. Could be interesting. But again, Callie Flanagan is definitely, as far as defenders that are available in free agency, someone that I'm curious to see if we see them move. And then I think there are a lot of intriguing forwards. Some that have, over the course of their pro careers, international careers, been absolutely dominant. For me, the top two names, I don't know that it's, well, I'll say three. There are three names as far as free agents that I think stand out immediately and could really be a boon to any team in the league. That's Natalie Spooner, who has played with Toronto. Teresa Vanishova played with Ottawa. And for me, I've said this name a bunch of times already, but Susanna Tapani, who played with the Boston Fleet. Like, for me, if you can find it in your, and keep a still, decent salary cap, I think if you make a competitive offer to any one of those three forwards, you are putting your team in a good position.
I think so. I do think Boston, it's in their best interest to keep Tapani and do whatever it takes after you lose Hillary Knight. And that's ostensibly the top free agent on the board right now.
Yep.
When all is said and done. So, to me, that's the mission for Boston.
I agree. And so let's talk about this from Tapani's perspective, and not just her, all of the players. So when you now know who has been depleted after the expansion draft, and soon we'll know through this window, or I should say, let's just talk about the expansion draft, because with this window, the free agents now are in a really interesting position, Rachel, because for the first time through the Players Association, at least internally, they're sharing salaries. So Tapani, who I agree with you, is top forward. Boston, I don't think, can afford to lose. Now, in theory, right, her team has more information with kind of where the market is at for top competitive forwards. And I wonder if and how that impacts her next contract, including whether she stays in Boston. Because if the dollars don't make sense, then Susanna Tapani's got to go for her sake and maybe for Boston's sake.
Well, and on the flip side of this too, I think the free agents that now know the other 12 players on each of the expansion teams and who's left on the other teams gives them some additional insight into what their playing opportunities will be, and potentially line mates and D partners and things of that nature. So I think these particular free agents are in possibly some of the best circumstances of any free agents on the table that we've ever seen.
Exactly.
In women's pro hockey.
Absolutely. And I for the sake of the players, want to see more of it. Does it make things complicated from a ownership standard? Well, maybe, but again, the ownership is singular. And so I don't know, like, how much truly, this is an interesting conversation. How much does that ownership group share with the GMs to be able to make decisions and things of that nature? Like, we're talking about the players having access to this. I would imagine, right, it would behoove a GM to have that information as well. So is this now a two-way street? Is there information that the ownership group has that isn't trickled down to the GMs? That seems like that doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, there's not the same autonomy for the individual teams than what we see when we talk about free agent signings in other leagues where ownership is individualized. So just some things, some food for thought. But again, that signing window opens at 9 a.m. Eastern, not Pacific, Eastern time on Monday. And then a week after that, Rachel, we are all in on the entry draft. But that'll do for our episode of the Women's Hockey Report for today. We will keep you updated on our next episode, which will air on Saturday, next week, Saturday. We'll talk a little bit more about some players that are draft eligible and what we think is kind of the fields. Where are is this a forward heavy draft, a goaltender heavy draft, things of that nature we'll talk about. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, make sure to follow us over at the Locked On NHL YouTube channel and on TikTok, women's_hockey_report. Until the next episode, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you soon. It's all right, Minnesota. It's going to be all right. Just hang tight.